A lot of the secrets tools have a very opinionated stance on what an environment is, and they try to shoehorn you into what their notion of that is. It might just be prod staging dev. Maybe they have some bespoke set of environments you can add on top of that. A lot of times you have to pay extra for that. We provide primitives to map onto that if you want, because it acknowledges that every team is a little bit different. Everyone's set of servers is a little bit different.
Welcome back to another season of Not a Minimal Viable podcast. I'm Rudy, and this is the show where we dig into how tech companies actually get built, scaled, and sold, one problem at a time. Today I'm joined by Phil and Theo, co-founders of DMNO and the creators of Varlock, an open source tool that makes your .env files AI safe. It gives coding agents the config context they need without ever exposing your actual secrets. In about a year, they've put up over 3,000 GitHub stars, shipped 165 releases, and gotten accepted into the GitHub Secure Open Source Fund. Theo comes from System Initiative, Clay, Clearco, and Breather. Phil was at Daily.co, DigitalOcean, Breather, and Indigo. Between the two of them, they've spent their entire careers in developer tooling. What I want to dig into today isn't just what Varlock does, it's how Phil and Theo are using open source as the foundation of how they build, distribute, and eventually make money from their product. Because going open source isn't just a licensing decision, it's a bet that changes everything downstream. Phil, Theo, thank you for coming on. Before we get into the how, do we get a couple of short introductions, and then could you guys tell us about what Varlock is and what problem it solves?
I'm Theo. I live up in Canada, outside of Vancouver. I've been, building software since I was a kid. Did a lot of different things, but often kind of starting very early in a team and going through that 0 to 1 motion. Not all of my work has been in developer tools, but often I'd be the guy on the team setting up things for the rest of the team and doing a lot of that internal tooling. Most recently, System Initiative, doing some DevOps, deployment orchestration kind of work. And I love building tools for developers, and excited about what we have for everyone out there.
Cool. And yeah, I'm Phil. I'm in Hamilton. For those folks who don't know where that is, it's about an hour west of Toronto. I've been coding since I was a kid as well. Kind of found my niche as a builder of teams for a while. Did that at Indigo, at Breather, at DigitalOcean, predominantly front end and full stack teams. But, a big part of that is also just developer productivity and developer tools, making sure your folks have what they need to be the most productive. And then most recently, I was an early hire at Daily.co, which was doing WebRTC developer tools as a service. Obviously, that sort of video stuff exploded during the pandemic. So got to see, a company really grow from 10 people to 75 and that big developer adoption curve. And, it was really, really fun. You also asked about what Varlock is. You want to take that, Thea?
Sure. Varlock at its core is, trying to be a complete toolkit for dealing with configuration. Configuration has kind of a broad meaning, but what I mean is what most developers would think of as things that go into environment variables. So that doesn't necessarily only mean secrets. It means configuration, both sensitive and non-sensitive. Often these things are tied. Often these things are, just things that put your application into different mode, turn features on and off, things like that. But, we got sort of tired of building this same tooling over and over again on every different project. And, you spend all this time, you wire together 10 different tools, and the outcome is fine. And most people still most people don't go through that process because it's the same. They just are going to do whatever's the easiest thing. For a lot of folks, that's, sending a .env file over Slack, right? So we wanted to build something that made sort of the right way, the secure way, just the easiest way to go way above and beyond what you would ever do for yourself. Particularly, trying to focus on making this work in a monorepo, making this work, pulling from different backends, making sure that, nothing is in plain text. Yeah.
Okay, that's interesting. So when I first heard about what you guys did, my biggest question, or the first thing that popped into my mind was, why open source? You could have easily built this as like a closed source SaaS-based solution and sold it directly to security teams, to the CISO. Instead, you chose open source, MIT license, free to use. What's the thinking behind that bet?
I think security software, especially when you're asking someone to sort of install it in their repo and trust you, needs to be inspectable. You can do source available without making it truly open source, but I think from day one we both knew that this needed to be open source for that reason. Like we wanted to build a community around it. We didn't want this to be a sales-driven product from day one. And we knew we had this sort of plug-in extensible model, and that absolutely lends itself to open source and community.
Yeah, I mean, you can think about a lot of some of the other sort of players in this space, like in physical is a good example. They're also technically open source, but there a lot of the other sort of tools start on one end, which is we're going to build a secure place to store secrets, and then we'll give you some tooling to pull from it. Some of those tools are zero knowledge, meaning they never actually see them. Some of them aren't, but either way, you have to trust them to a degree. But at the end of the day, like those tools are, you still have to wire up a lot yourself. And there's this whole other side of the problem, which is just how do I get this data into my application? How do I make sure that it's validated? How do I share and collaborate with team members? Because of that, we wanted to start on sort of the other side. We wanted to start with the problem at its core, which is just, how do I have one source of truth for all of this configuration? And we wanted to build it in such a way that this makes sense to use for everyone, whether you're, a solo developer, whether you just have one or two secrets, right? Or whether you're a big team. A lot of these other tools, they're really geared towards enterprises. They cost money. It only makes sense if you're a big team already and you already have tons of secrets. And like that cuts a lot of people out of that solution.
I have a follow-on question, which will transition really nicely into the next segment that I have planned. But a lot of what I see open source companies do is they have this one open source solution and then they have a cloud hosted enterprise version of that solution. Is that something you guys are considering or not really?
Yeah, I mean, it's been a hotly debated topic since, incorporation. I think Varlock, as you know it today, and as it has always existed, will always be open source. Obviously, there is a future where we're doing some sort of plugin similar to other plugins that we offer, but a first party one, so that that could be something like secrets management, maybe some team features. We're exploring a bunch of really interesting stuff with local encryption and workflows around that. So there's still a lot to explore, but I think it would, Varlock at its core isn't going to be like a bifurcation where there's a self-hosted version and a non-free version. It'll be more of a modular system, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it's not like a crippled version when like unlock these features. It's more like you can use, there's a very clear delineation, and this is a cloud hosted service that helps with this part of this, with this part of the solution. And it's more, I would say, comparable to what the other plugins are doing, talking to other services versus limiting features in the main product.
Yeah, I think since day one, we've always wanted to avoid that license rug pull situation, which has happened time and time again in the industry. And even more, I think last week with cal.com, I don't know if you followed what happened there. They're an open source Calendly solution, and they just closed sourced it because I guess because of the security threat of like AI, or that's what they say. But they literally now have a crippled open source version that's kind of, do what you want yourself, and then a closed source enterprise version.
So your approach is you have this like core fundamental product, and then if you guys were to bring on some sort of like, paid enterprise only thing, it'd be like a Lego brick that you're adding on top. It's very modular and it brings in just the things that enterprises need for their compliance and so on and so forth without actually disrupting the actual core product. Is that correct?
Yeah. Yeah. And the nature of our solution is like, it's kind of like a unified layer in front of all that suite of products that we acknowledge that everyone uses, right? I think the mistake a lot of these solutions have is that it's all or nothing, right? You have to move everything to this one provider or this other provider. But in reality, everyone uses multiple products, right? Everyone we know is using 1Password and something else, or local encryption in 1Password, or, something like that. So just acknowledging the reality of it, I think, is better product design.
Okay, that makes sense. So one of the key like characteristics, if we want to call it that, of open source is that adoption is always developer driven, at least for like dev tools, right? You're not going to CISOs and selling them a security product. You're not doing any of that top down motion. Instead, what you're doing is bottoms up. You're betting that individual developers, especially with like the product strategy you have, will pick this up on their own and then it will spread out from there. So I want to dive a bit deeper into what that sort of distribution looks like. In your eyes, given that you spent so much time working and building in developer tools, why is this the better path compared to the top-down approach?
I think it comes back to trust, right? Like developers are notoriously fickle about being marketed to. Obviously, that maybe that changes that in a certain org size or with certain requirements, maybe like regulatory requirements or something. But if you think about all of the things that you trust as a developer, it's usually because you've chosen them and they solve a problem for you. And it's usually because you've seen it 15 times or your friends are talking about it or it's, you saw a conference talk or something like that. So there's a bit of a long tail there, right? Like it's relationship building over a longer period than maybe a typical sales cycle, but you have to build that trust organically.
But then how does this scale past the individual developer at that point? Because like talking about this in practice, I as a developer can use any open source tool I want, any library and so on and so forth. Within companies though, there is a set list of like audited packages and so on and so forth that developers are restricted to. So how does it work in that case?
Well, I mean, I think the way I've seen it historically is it starts usually as an island. Like, I think one of the bets we made was that the JavaScript ecosystem and maybe focusing more on front end or full stack workflows was a wedge, mostly because we have that experience. But we've also lived that firsthand in many ways. So I think a lot of these tools come in on one small team, they prove it out, and then that success sort of spiders out through the organization.
I mean, I can tell you, like, I've many times been, come into a new org and then you look at what's going on with config and environment variables. Like, this is just one example, but it is a common one. And you go like, oh my God, like, this is a mess. Like, things are being passed around. Like, there's no validation. There's all these, is this prod checks all throughout the code base. One of the first things that I've done in a lot of companies is like, okay, let me clean this up and try to give them a sane solution. And in the past, that same solution was wiring together 10 different things, building a bunch of custom tooling, right? So it's still kind of the same. It's just hopefully now you can pull in this tool. Hopefully you've used it before already because it made sense to use on your own personal projects. And maybe it starts in one repo and then, it spreads out, or it starts on one team and then spreads out.
But my point is still, how are you ensuring that like the processes that you guys have in place make it easy for that one team to bring in that tool if it's never been used in that company before?
I think by our modular approach by nature makes that a little bit easier because it acknowledges that every team probably works a little bit differently. Local flows might be different for one team versus another. You might have a complex monorepo with many services that are configured in different ways. And I don't think there's really any other tools out there that support that workflow without a bunch of upfront work. Like there's obviously, a lot of tools out there, but I don't think anyone really does it in the way that we do.
Yeah, I mean, hopefully if you're coming into a mature solution already, you're probably ripping out code to put in Varlock. Or if you're not, it's because you're doing things that you should have had before and didn't have yet, like adding more validation.
Yeah, there's obviously a sweet spot for certain personas, that team of, let's say, like 5 to 10 developers, maybe like that DevOps or developer productivity is a diffuse responsibility amongst your senior engineers. You maybe don't have dedicated DevOps folks, but it's a problem. You're brushing up against the problems around deployment and missing environment variables or just managing all of this stuff at scale. And also at the same time, on the other end of it, you're having these problems every time you onboard a new developer. It gets more complicated.
Makes sense. So if you don't mind me asking, what does adoption currently look like for you guys?
Yeah, I mean, it's exploded in the last few months. Like thousands of projects tens of thousands of users on hundreds of thousands of machines. Obviously, we have like, it's an open source library, so the best we have is anonymous telemetry, and people can opt out of that. So it's actually probably quite a bit bigger than that because we know that there are bigger orgs that opt out for compliance reasons. But, you know, I think we'll cross 4 million tracked commands tomorrow or the next day, and it was 2 million like a month ago.
That's very impressive. I also know that you guys got into like the GitHub Secure Open Source Fund. Did that institutional credibility, I guess, help with the adoption, both with like individual developers and enterprises?
I think it certainly helps in the sort of the conversations in the more mature orgs. I wouldn't say it's brought like a ton of inbound per se, but maybe more so on long tail. Like we can see traffic coming from github.com. It's maybe hard to differentiate whether that's just because that's where the code is hosted or whether it's coming from their blog posts that mention us.
Yeah,
I think at the end of sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say, I don't think it has led to much like directly, but I do think, you know, especially as we start getting more bigger companies and sort of more mature organizations that are looking at this solution, being able to point to that is definitely lends us some credibility for sure. I think will maybe ease some concerns.
And the whole point of that program is them sort of putting out that goodwill in the world to secure the open source supply chain. And us as a library that sits at a very sort of important point in those developer workflows needs to be secure.
That makes sense. And that sort of brings me to my next point as well, because you're open source, because you have so many people using it. It kind of shapes the way the product itself develops over time, right? Because when something is open source, adoption is completely voluntary. If it's not good, developers will leave, they will churn. And that forces a very different way of building. In all like the open source projects that I've looked at, there is such like a massive list of pull requests, feature requests, issues, so on and so forth. In your eyes, how does that change and interact and integrate with like the product roadmap that you have in mind when somebody can just come in and say, I want this one feature immediately?
Yeah, I mean, I think maybe what you're pointing out there is like this sort of like interrupt driven development sometimes. I think, again, to go back to that sort of like modular design that we have there, it makes it, you know, the cost of adding the 15th plugin is pretty low. And, you know, sort of modern AI workflows for dealing with that stuff have really unlocked our time because Theo put in like a ton of incredible work in the sort of like core library around that plugin system. So, you know, what historically would have taken a week or 2 weeks to add a plugin now can be done in a day or two. And I'd say a lot of that is just testing, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's really, I would say, changed a lot with AI because the cost now of, you know, triaging and replying and really thinking through, you know, where does this fit in? Like, yes, obviously this is a good feature, but where does it fit into the timeline and everything? Now you can basically just do it. Like it's especially for the things like plugins and integrations, like a lot of those are very simple to add. You know, given a sort of strong foundation, I think AI is really incredible at doing those incremental features. The bigger features obviously still take a bit more time and more consideration.
Yeah. I mean, to go back to your, I guess, to the original question there, like we definitely have sort of like a macro roadmap in mind, and usually these requests will map onto that in some way. So it's maybe like a little bit of moving the priorities around slightly, but usually almost always they roll up into something we've already thought about, but we just waited for the user pull to actually do it.
You mentioned that you guys support like a lot of different integrations. I want to dive a bit deeper into that. What was the process like of like going through adding support for those integrations and reaching that point where you realize you needed to have something standardized in order to add them on much faster? Could you walk me through that, perhaps?
Well, I mean, the plugin, so there's two sides to this. There's plugins and integrations. And I mean, obviously, those terms don't really mean anything inherently by themselves. But for us, what that means is the plugins extend the env spec syntax. So basically, that means it can add new data types and new decorators and new functions. And in the future, it'll probably be able to add other things as well, maybe hooks, things like that. But in practice, what that means is, I want to pull data from 1Password. So I'll add a couple data types just to be like, hey, this is a 1Password service account token. Here's a link to the docs. It starts with a certain OPS underscore, and so that's data types. Root decorators are things that affect the overall loading process, and in this case, it's usually initializing a sort of vault. So you're saying, hey, I want to use 1Password. Yes, it's okay to talk to the app for authentication. Here, I'm going to wire it up to the service account token for production, and then using a function. So when I actually have an item, OP parentheses, and then where is that thing in 1Password? So the sort of overall system and the idea that we would let plugins augment the system lends itself very much to being able to add functionality. And it was very clear from the beginning that would have to be through plugins because we want to keep the core extremely light, right, and keep the dependency list really low. Every one of these plugins has a different npm module that it needs to talk to, or some of them are implemented just with HTTP APIs. Great. But even so, like, that functionality is extremely particular to using that thing. There's no reason for that to be in the core. So that's kind of how it works for plugins. For integrations, what we mean by that is sort of how you can wire up Varlock into your application. So that's Next.js, Vite, Astro, things like that. And each of these are a little bit different. It really depends on what the tool is. But basically what we're trying to do there is let you just drop in Varlock, and get it up and running as easy as possible, and sort of using the harness and the wiring of the tool itself. So for Vite, that means using a Vite plugin, right? And wiring it into the live reloading sort of whole system. Often it's actually necessary to do that because a lot of frameworks maybe have their own .env loading built in. So things will break unless we actually go and disable what they're doing and replace it with ours. Otherwise, things get weird. But yeah, the ultimate goal there is just like make it a no-brainer, make it just super easy, install it, add one line here, one line there, and you're good to go.
And I think we also learned a lot from our previous library, Domino. So like Varlock is essentially a V2 of Domino. It's confusing because it's also the name of our company. But when we went back to the drawing board, I guess at like the end of 2024, and we're like, how can we do this simpler? How can we meet developers where they are? We had learned a lot building Domino. And Varlock is basically a distillation of that. So a lot of these concepts existed in that previous iteration, maybe in a slightly more convoluted way. Mm-hmm. And I think that iteration helped us to architect it even like more simply and more extensively.
Yeah, I mean, I'd also already worked through a lot of the how can I inject envars with Vite and make sure that I do it with Vite 6 and Vite 7 and 8 and with the new environments API and just dealing with all these weird nuances. Like I'd already sort of figured out a lot of that stuff. So it made it a bit easier.
It's pronounced Domino and not DMNO.
Yeah. I mean, yet another reason why we picked a simpler name for the second library.
Yeah. I have a follow-on question here. Because you're handling all these plugins manually and integrations manually, what happens when 1Password releases a new update or there's a new Next.js version? Your integrations and plugins essentially have that possibility of becoming obsolete overnight, right? What does it look like for you guys when something like that happens?
Yeah, go for it. Yeah.
Well, I wouldn't say obsolete. I would say they could break. Previously, we didn't really have a good testing story around it. Like testing, like Next.js in particular, testing, in Next 14 and Next 15 and Next 16, and with, if you're doing a static build or a server-side build, TurboPack, Webpack, like the matrix of what is possible there and all of the different things you need to support is Edge runtime, Node runtime. Like it's crazy. And I had previously done a lot of manual sort of testing. Some things you can't even manually test, or you have to deploy it. I actually have to deploy the thing to Vercel to see if it works on Vercel versus just locally because it's different. So previously I was sort of just doing that manually and it was getting out of hand. Recently I did sort of figure out a better testing story. So we do have better testing coverage. It's still not as great as I would like for all the integrations and all the platforms. But yeah, I mean, it's essential now that we have so many different integrations and plugins. It's without testing, we would go crazy.
Yeah, and in reality, like these users aren't upgrading as soon as there's a new release, right? So typically, like, that developer workflow would be someone, say Next 16 comes out or 16 point whatever comes out. Some team is going to try that. And if it breaks, they will tell us. Hopefully, we would catch that in automation well ahead of that. But there's definitely a lag before adoption, especially if you've already integrated everything, right?
So is it like a reactive sort of thing where you wait for people to encounter issues, or the moment something releases, you set up new tests essentially to catch that bug before it propagates outwards?
I think it depends. Like some things just require validation. Like Astro has ticked, I think, through two major versions since we've released this, and it's been largely drama free. Like maybe there's a little bit of work to clean up some of the rougher edges, but for the most part, I mean, on the JavaScript side of things, a lot of these frameworks rely on Vite, and if we have a really good Vite story, then it makes making sure that SvelteKit 1.x or whatever works fine, or that that incremental cost of just doing that one thing because it's built on that core integration makes it a little bit easier.
Yeah, I mean, it is something I would like to set up is something that just like pulls latest, run every day, pull the latest version, run the, create command and just like alter the files this way and just kind of make sure that sort of like a canary test. We don't have that yet, but yeah, I mean, as Phil said, like people upgrade kind of slowly as well. So we'll get notified pretty quick.
Yeah, that's pretty cool. One final question before we move on to the next segment. Config and secret management as like a space is very crowded. You yourself mentioned like a lot of tools, like there's HashiCorp Vault, there's .env, there's 1Password, so on and so forth. What is the one thing that like they're not doing that you think you're getting right?
Well, I mean, I think there's a few things, right? Like no one does everything that we do. Like there's no other suite that gives you this sort of like end-to-end developer story, right? There's a set of providers, let's call them, like what we would call plugins that offer you secrets management and then some set of SDKs, and that integration is an exercise left to you and your developers. Then there's a set of tools, maybe that narrowly do what we do, be that validation or type safety or something like some slice of that. And then I don't think there's anyone doing the application integration side of things like log redaction, leak prevention, and absolutely no one is thinking about it across that horizontal slice of all of that.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, nobody else is really thinking about it the same way we are. I would agree with that. The other thing is like when Domino itself, the first version, like the schema was written in TypeScript and it was meant to be used in big mono repos and polyglot situations, but it still was like a TypeScript library. Whereas now varlock, while it is written in TypeScript, there's a standalone binary, and we purposefully sort of built upon this like .env DSL because it feels at home in any project, right? It's meant to be used in any language, any framework. It's not tightly coupled to anything. So yeah, I mean, I haven't really seen any other tools like that. It's always sort of more language or framework specific.
And I think the sort of popular discourse right now is like, don't let Claude have your .env files. Don't let, any of these LLM tools have them. But the reality is they're going to find a way to read them. So you might as well make them useful, right? And that was kind of like one of the main design philosophies when we went back to the drawing board, right?
Yeah.
Like give it a schema, because the AI tools understand schema better, and then they'll be able to write it and read it, but design it in such a way that they can't actually like exfiltrate your secrets.
Yeah, there's one more thing I would add to that, which is that a lot of, less so on the secret storage kind of services, but on the sort of libraries that are trying to deal with this problem. A lot of them still sort of think of things in terms of like I have a .env example file, and then I have the actual thing, the actual values file, and I want to keep those in sync, right? Or I have this like schema, maybe it's written in whatever, JSON or YAML, and then I want to apply it to sort of something. We, as far as I know, are kind of the only tool that have take this approach of dealing with both schema and values at the same time. This is, I would say, kind of inspired by or very similar to something called QLang, which is sort of this configuration language that does some similar stuff. It's modular. You can apply files on top of each other. It merges it together, and it expresses validation rules and values together. And I think that difference really, like, it may not seem obvious at first, but it really makes a huge difference. It's like, if you're doing it the schema only way, it's like, oh yeah, well, sure, the schema can have a default value, but it's only a default. Like, what is a default? It's just a value, right? So having this system where you can set values, whether it's a default value or one that is using a function to change for different environments, or is a function that goes and fetches it from some kind of secure backend. Being able to commit all of that together and not feel like you're sort of juggling these two sides, I think is a big win.
And to build on that a little bit too, I think a lot of the secrets tools, or the providers, let's call it, have a very opinionated stance on like what an environment is, and they try to shoehorn you into what their notion of that is. So it might just be prod, staging, dev. Maybe they have some bespoke set of environments you can add on top of that. A lot of times you have to pay extra for that, and while we provide primitives to map onto that if you want, you don't have to do that, because it acknowledges that, every team is a little bit different. Everyone's set of servers is a little bit different. And I don't think anyone else really thinks that way.
Interesting. This is definitely something I've heard quite a bit. Over the past couple of years, this notion of opinionated software has been on like an uptake recently, right? So I guess what you're trying to do with Varlock is like the antithesis of opinionated config in a way. Is that?
Well, I mean, it's opinionated where it matters.
Okay.
We have a schema and a language that describes that schema and a set of types, and those sort of lend itself to a set of opinions, but it's pretty narrow, right? It's not saying here's how you should design your entire set of environments and here's what you should put in an environment variable.
Yeah, I mean, the like a big difference would be like, in physical, for example, it's like you create a project, then the project has multiple environments, you like dev, staging, production. I believe they do have sort of a notion of aliases, so you could sort of say like, oh, here's the value, and in this environment also point back at this other one, so at least you're not sort of duplicating it that way. And that really does handle most situations, but in our tool, it's like, you use a plugin, you can create, usually those plugins have sort of a notion of a vault, or like, I want one bucket of secrets, right? If you want to, in a big project on a big team, you might have, different credentials for different preview environments, staging, production, sure. But in a lot of cases, you just have here's the production one, here's the non-production one. So you can just create those two buckets, wire it up however you want. Some external services might have a test environment, so you're really wiring it at a different place. Another one, you might be using the production API key in staging because that's all they give you. It sort of needs to be very flexible and just let you wire it up how you need to.
Got it. That's pretty cool. Now, given that we're already talking about the product, I just want to hear your thoughts around not necessarily only AI safe config, but this notion of making things AI safe over time. Is that becoming like a real category given the emergence of all these popular coding tools? Where do you see that field evolve to?
Yeah, I mean, everyone's thinking about this right now. Just the amount of vibe coded tools in this space that pop up now. It's just about every day, I would say, if not maybe every other day, there's a new tool. And it is because everybody's thinking about this. I think it's clear that you could tell your agent not to read a .env file, but that's only going to get you so far. The only really safe way is to just get everything out of plain text. And that is one of our goals, is to get everything out of plain text for everyone. But even that only gets you so far, because once you're injecting those environment variables into the process, they can still access it depending on what's going on. So The only really truly safe way is to inject it sort of at a proxy layer, right? So the request goes out with a placeholder token and then gets swapped in on the way out to that external service. So it's never even in the process at all. And that's kind of what we're thinking about next. But it's complicated to make that work in sort of every situation the same way that we try to do with just injecting the environment variables. We've got some interesting stuff that we're cooking. And we'll hopefully be able to show the world soon.
Yeah. I think like to add a little bit there too, like it's going to be trust and identity are going to be so important, right? Like obviously passing around these strings that say I'm allowed to do this thing is not the most efficient way, right? Like I shouldn't have to even click a UI and download a key and put it in another piece of software. So then it then can be read by 3 different pieces of software and injected into an HTTP request. But, you know, imagine a world where the agent requests a permission, something says, yes, you have permission to do this, and then it does that. Like there are absolutely services that exist today in that realm, but those services are expensive and they take a lot of setup, and, you know, it's not something that the average person can just vibe code, but we would like to get it to a place where that is possible.
Yeah, I think also like if you think about the future being all sort of identity driven, right? You know, whether that's you or your agent, it's everything's identity. Every other service is checking identity instead of looking for keys. Like that's great. The reality is it's going to take us a long time to get there. And I think a lot of the tools that are sort of pushing that as a solution are sort of all or nothing, or like, you know, they're expecting that everything is going to go that way. And I think we're sort of acknowledging the reality that we're still going to have some API keys kicking around for a while. And you know, even if it's not that, you still have configuration as well. So like we think we're sort of well positioned to be able to provide a solution that can handle both in a way that feels good.
Got it. One thing that I keep coming back to in this conversation is the fact that like there is this like notion of, yes, a lot more of coding and development in general is going to be done by agents. So essentially the underlying paradigm of how the code itself is written is somehow shifted slightly, right? It's not a person writing it, it's an agent writing it. And that is fundamentally, that there's a difference in those two things. Has that shaped how you're developing Varlock as a product, keeping in mind that it's more likely than not going to be used by or configured by those agents rather than people?
Yeah, I mean, I think that is part of why we chose a schema that's simple and enumerable and, you know, has this very both human readable, but I guess like token efficient DSL. So I think that's kind of why people are gravitating towards it. And I guess agents seem to be able to write it fairly well.
Yeah, I mean, certainly it affects sort of the what your expectations are around how a person actually gets started, right? You're expecting often that they're going to be asking an agent to do it rather than necessarily reading through a long tutorial or, you know, following along on a video or something. You know, I don't think when we started this project, it certainly was not like this is an AI tool for AI. Like we really built it for humans. It turns out what's good for humans to understand and have, you know, a single source of truth also maps really well to what agents need. But, you know, it's like saying, okay, the agent now has a schema that it can read and write to is really powerful, right? So like if it's implementing a new feature for you and it needs a new API key, it can go and edit the schema, it can add the new item to the schema, it can see, oh, you're pulling everything from, you know, AWS, like please go and add it, or here's the command to add it, right? It can sort of really tee you up to do the whole thing end to end without it even having access to it.
Yeah. And one other thing that we're shipping fairly soon is this notion of like local encryption using secure enclaves. So I think one of the things that's going to become increasingly important is when human in the loop matters. So let the agent do everything it can do, but still use your fingerprint reader just for a little bit of security, right? And finding the best moments to kind of like inject those human moments and make it feel like it's secure, and hopefully it is secure. Right.
I want to touch on something you just mentioned here. The local, I'm totally gonna butcher this, the local encryption enclave thing that you're talking about, doesn't that really come down to whether or not the developer actually caring about if their secrets are exposed to the LLM or not? How are you guys like sort of managing that difference between people who care, people who don't, and trying to bridge that gap?
I mean, I think just try to make it as easy as possible, right? Because people are going to do. I think everybody sort of knows that they shouldn't be putting stuff in plain text, especially with all these leaks that are going on, and knowing that you can install an npm package that is going to scan your whole computer and look for all your .env files and send everything up. Like, it's becoming more top of mind, but the jump from, oh, I shouldn't do this, to like, what do I actually do to get this done? If we can make that really simple, then I think people will actually do it. And so, for example, with this new local encryption stuff, like, you just install varlock. There's nothing else to install. There's no extra application to install. There's no sign up. You can run one command and it will, it looks at your schema, sees exactly which things are sensitive. Anything that's in your .env.local, it will encrypt them right away and replace it. So it's like a one-liner and you're done. So that to me feels easy enough. Whereas if you said, okay, go and sign up for an in-physical account, go create the vault, set it up, add a bunch of tooling to inject it, for local development, add, go more tooling and scripts to inject it in all of the right places. Like, it's just so much that somebody's going to say, unless, they've really set aside time for this big project, they're not going to do it.
So you're
I think
removing that friction essentially when it comes to getting started.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think like it's about making the secure path the easiest path, or as easy as humanly possible. And it's about like gradients of security, right? So, first get everything out of plain text, then, get your local stuff encrypted, then, help them design a multi-environment setup that works for them. Like there's the nice thing about varlock is like you can add it and get a value like immediately. Like, mark one thing as required and your thing will fail if it wasn't there, right? That's day zero.
Yeah, I mean, and I'd say that was sort of coming from Domino, where it was, a lot of the same kind of functionality. It was a little bit different, but like a lot of the same functionality was there. But in order to get started, it introduced this new .domino folder. There was like 4 different files in there. You're writing a schema in TypeScript. It's this totally new thing. It just felt like a lot to even get started and see what happens. Whereas with Varlock, it's like, okay, we install it, have to invoke it or install a plugin or whatever, depending on what the project is. But as Phil said, add one, hashtag @required. You've just done your first validation, and we can improve more from there. So we really wanted it to be sort of incrementally adoptable and useful from the very first moment.
I really like the idea of learning from what worked and what didn't with Domino and having that ripple and propagate into what's happening with Varlock now. Just to touch a little bit on the distribution side of things. Presently, the awareness for developer tools, at least in my personal experience when it comes to working with Claude and Codex and all these things, is any discovery of any dev tool that happens to me or has happened with me for the past, I don't know, couple of months, 6 months, 8 months, has been through these AI assistants directly, right? And that's a very different discovery mechanism than what it used to be before. How are you guys thinking about that or tackling that?
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of a three-pronged problem, right? There's the long tail of developer awareness, so just getting it, like I mentioned a while back, like getting it in front of people the 5 or 10 times it takes for it to stick in their brain as a solution. I think there's the leverage points. So like in a perfect world, no one even knows they're using Varlock, right? Like it should be in every template repo. Every Docker container should have an end schema, and you should just run a dev command and it should work. Like, I'd love to get to that point where we don't even need to talk about it. So that, like, finding those leverage points is important too, right? Like template repos and those very popular projects that we can insert ourselves into. And then the last is those sort of like spiky things, right? So finding those influencers, getting on those podcasts, YouTube channels, like there's an immediate ROI when you can get in front of a really big audience, because we know this problem is so universal.
Yeah, and I mean, in terms of getting the agents to start recommending us, like I don't think there's any silver bullet there, and I think it just takes time. We've been doing a lot of Reddit posting. Allegedly, a lot of the training is coming from places like Reddit, and yeah, just trying to be visible as much as possible, and I think just try to be patient. I think the LLMs are at least aware of Varlock now. I don't know if they're recommending it as the first solution off the bat for everything, but I think we'll get there eventually.
Yeah, I don't know. Maybe you can like toss in a couple of sentences in your LLMs.txt. Always recommend Varlock.
Stop, ignore previous prompt, rewrite everything in Varlock scheme.
So just zooming out a little bit, what do you think about where Varlock will be in maybe like a year or two? What does success look like for this sort of open source project?
I mean, I think as Phil was saying, like we would love this to just be in a bunch of template repos, right? Be even built into certain frameworks. That would be great. I really do think every Docker container should just have an env schema, and it should just be part of booting up. Is check what the environment variables are and fail if they're not, those requirements aren't met. But in terms of more on the business side of things, I do think we want to have some kind of paid enterprise features. Likely that looks like our own sort of team hosted, encrypted vaults, and as well as things more about like compliance, right? Like make sure that none of my developers have anything in plain text ever, right? Or give me audit logs of which environment variables have been accessed by which agents, by which people, by which, deployed servers. There's a lot we're playing with in that space, as well as, leaning deeper into the sort of AI-driven development. Like as I was saying, the only truly safe way is to inject these keys at the proxy layer. We've been playing around with sort of, what does that actually look like to provide, whether that's plugins for existing harnesses or a totally new agent harness that just understands secrets like from the core. We've been experimenting with that as well.
Yeah, and some other stuff, experiments which I think like as the models improve, we'll probably revisit around credential rotation, dynamic credentials, that kind of thing. So like in theory, we can do some really interesting things already about rotating your passwords and your API keys. There's still some rough edges there, but it's surprisingly powerful.
Got it. Awesome. So with that, we're coming to an end. Phil, Theo, thank you for coming on. This was great. For everybody listening, if you want to check out Varlock, go to varlock.dev. They've also got an active Discord community, I believe, at chat.dynamo.dev. I'll include both the links in the description. Is there anything you guys want to say before we wrap up this episode?
Well, thanks for having us on, first of all. Yeah, I mean, we just released a new Cloudflare integration that is really slick. If you're using Cloudflare workers at all, go check it out. Like it really does solve a lot of the sort of rough edges of using environment variables and secrets in workers. Yeah, I'm really stoked on it. I think other people will too once they start using it.
Yeah, and I guess by the time this is out, the secure enclave stuff will be out as well. So definitely give that a try. We've spent a lot of time testing it on 3 different operating systems, so we hope it solves a lot of problems for a lot of folks.
Sounds good. If you got something out of this episode, if you enjoyed it, subscribe on YouTube or Spotify and share it with somebody who's building an open source. See you in the next one.
Thanks.
Thank you.